anywhere in the Bible where there's an acknowledgement that human beings even have a right to be treated with fairness and decency? You find a few good teachings here and there, but on balance, we are worms, we are sinners, we are deserving of death. The God of the Bible commits mass genocides of people who disagree with him. He's not a very good role model, and if the saints are getting their morality from the God of the Bible, it's a good thing they ignored it. It's a good thing they rose above the Christian system.
Well, they know how to read it. I would also ask about this standard here of where do you get morally good? If you don't acknowledge any absolute standard, where do you get what is morally good? What is that? You say, well, this humanism. Where is that? Where is the fulfillment of a human being?
Yeah, that almost sounds like surprising someone even asked that question. By definition, things that harm us are not good for us. You agree. Lack of shelter, disease, natural disasters, predation, wars, hunger, thirst. These are things that harm us, right? And so, by nature, we want to avoid those things that harm us because they contribute to our well-being as individuals and as a group and as a species. If we didn't avoid those things, we wouldn't be here. If our ancestors hadn't done that. In fact, some of the ancestors didn't, and they didn't reproduce as well. So natural selection shows how we, who got here, are the direct result of successful ancestors who got where we are. So, good and evil are not things. Morality is not a thing. It's just a functioning of the brain as we're making value judgments. So we can use those words with lowercase letters, good and evil, let's just say, to stand for, good would stand for those things which enhance human well-being and human life, which feed us and clothe us and shelter us and give us protection and fight disease and those things. And evil, with the lowercase e, are those things which deliberately don't. So people, not everybody's as healthy as everyone. Not everybody's as healthy and kind as you are. There are some people that tell into the distribution of humanity that are psychopathic, sociopathic. They're not mentally well off, and we have to build prisons and have systems of defense and mental hospitals for those few people. But on balance, the rest of us are basically good. The whole myth of original sin is a big lie, really. So we humanists can use good and evil not as cosmic absolutes, but relative to those values that we have as human beings that are conducive to our well-being.
You make it sound like it's so easy to know what is really good, but...
No, I didn't say that.
Well,
it's sometimes very, very hard.
Okay.
I didn't say
how does it determine?
It is easy to find harm, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not always easy to know what to do. What action should I take? That's why you have moral dilemmas. Sometimes it's extremely difficult. Sometimes we don't know what the absolute thing to do is. Sometimes we have to compromise. But harm itself is an objective principle upon which then we can base our decision. So there is an objective basis within nature. It's material. It's natural. And so...
You say it's an absolute principle?
Not absolute, no, it would be objective. Because things could change. And what could harm us in this generation might change. And that's why it's important to people...
It's absolute or it's changing?
The principle of avoiding harm, by definition, that principle itself is an objective principle that I wouldn't call it absolute, because if we didn't exist, it wouldn't exist either. It's relative to humanity. That's why in humanism, humans are the measure. It depends. If we had evolved to require arsenic for our survival, then me giving you a bottle of arsenic would be a good thing rather than a bottle of water. It's conditional. It depends on how we happen to evolve as a species. So the principle, the humanistic principle of trying to act in ways that end up minimizing overall harm, that's an objectively based principle. And using that principle, then you have a grip on how you can start analyzing. The problem is we're not as informed as we can be. We don't know all the consequences of every action, nor do we know the future. We don't always know how these consequences are going to act. So you can be acting on good faith, if I can borrow a word. You can be acting on good intentions. If it truly is your intention to pick the course of action that results in the minimal amount of real harm in the world, then you can be called a good person. If that is not your intention, depending on who you are, then you can be called a bad person. If you are trying to create more harm than necessary, then you are a bad person. You might have to be locked up or whatever.
Your objective principle of no harms, to me, sounds pretty much like what I would call an absolute principle. The problem with that is that there's other kinds of atheists, not the nice kind of atheist you are, but there's other atheists out there, like Nietzsche, who would say, Mr. Barker, I don't care for your no harm rule. I don't care a bit for that, because that's a borrowed thing from Christianity you have, because you've been a Christian and in a way you still want to be a nice guy. But I just want to be the Superman, the Ubermensch, and dominate society and do whatever I want. And who are you? Why are you going to stop me? It's you against me.
Well, he has every right to think that way. Hitler had every right to think that way. Stalin was a horrible atheist, by the way, just like Hitler was a horrible Christian. I mean, evil knows no religious boundaries here. But that Nietzsche, that person who's mentally unhealthy or who's psychopathic or sociopathic, those people, those big warlord dictators, and they've existed all through history, they will think that, and they're free to think that, and we may never change their mind. You can't change the mind of the sociopath. They just won't. There's something wrong in their brains. But fortunately, there's enough of us on this planet who do love humanity enough to protect ourselves from people like that. We have laws, we have systems of justice, we have systems of self-defense. So even though Hitler might have thought what he was doing was right, there's enough of us who realize that for the sake of the survival of our species, we can judge that his actions were actually causing more harm than good. We can judge objectively that the actions of that person, regardless of what they think is right or wrong, and regardless of whether they feel guilty or not, and maybe they never will, the rest of us can judge, and that's one of the good things about a state. A state can impose a system of morality called law, by which we can attempt to control and protect ourselves from those few sick individuals who disagree with the people in this room, who think we should be kind and giving and nice and sacrificing.
I think you will find, though, many societies would agree on evil things, and in fact, the Germany of the 1930s, the propaganda was a case of that. Slavery is not a case.
But we can still judge it because of the harm. How do you know it's good or bad?
Well, it was not. I mean, it was a great benefit for society to have slaves. It was a great harm to lose them, but it was still more.
But overall, the harm to society by having slaves. By the way, the Bible is not anti-slavery. The Bible nowhere says that slavery should be abolished. Why didn't Jesus, instead of saying that Jesus showed us how compassionate he was. I'm sure you know your Bible. When he said, there are some slaves that you should not beat as hard as others because they didn't know better. Why didn't Jesus, this great moral teacher, yes, it is what it says. Yes, it is. You should know your Bible. There are some slaves. Yes, that's exactly what it says.
Where?
Well, I don't have my Bible with me, but if you're challenging me on that, and I will give you that exact verse. There are some slaves, and the Greek word is doulos, the slaves, who didn't know the Lord's will and didn't do right. They should be beaten with few stripes. But there are those who did know the Lord's will and who did wrong, and they should be beaten with many stripes.
It's talking about me.
But the point is,
slaves.
It's talking about slaves. That was the order of the day. Why didn't Jesus, this great moral leader, why didn't Jesus tell us, by the way, folks, there's something wrong with slavery. It's a bad idea. Why didn't he teach us a few more? Why did he only reflect the culture of his time? Why did he not have something really valuable to tell us? So, and if you read through the New Testament, you see that he was just a product of the morality, the primitive morality of the people who wrote that book.
That's where he was killed. If you read Genesis 1, made in the image of God, and letter to Philemon, you have an answer to that. Those Christian principles laid there, Jewish Christian principles, are what led to the abolition of slavery. It was Christians, by the way, who abolished slavery.
No, it wasn't just Christians. There were many non-believers. There were Christians involved. They were liberal Christians, basically. They were called infidels, by the way, because they were going against the teaching of the Bible. The Bible is pro-slavery, and it's to the credit of many Christians that they are smarter than the Bible. They rose above the Bible. They embraced humanistic principles, democratic principles, and it's to their credit that they are loving people, because a lot of Christians take the Bible and were pro-slavery. Many of the sermons from the South were quoting from the scriptures about how much you should pay for a slave. The Bible is basically a slave manual when you read through the whole thing. But it's to the credit. It's to the credit of people like you who have risen above that little book, and I applaud your values. I applaud your humanistic values, that you've risen above that. You're not using the Bible as your absolute moral standard. You're using your mind. You're using your mind and your heart and your common sense. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's the Holy Spirit.
That's actually good. Mr. Barker, would you like to ask Father Lucas a question before we're out of time? We just have how many more minutes? Just 3 more minutes. So would you like to ask Father Lucas a question so we can have one question each at least? That was a good discussion.
Yeah. So according to your absolute moral principles, is birth control a good thing or an evil thing, and how do you know?
Let me think. One thing I'd like to say first of that is, I think the difficulty in establishing what is morally right, it's difficult in some cases to know that. That's not an argument to say that there's no moral right or wrong. There's no absolute value. Because that's a common mistake. And say, well, it's so difficult to determine this circumstance. What should I do in this particular case? Therefore, there's no moral principles. That's like saying, well, the principle of harm doesn't work. Because it's so hard to determine in this particular case which is less harmful.
That's not what I said.
Okay.
That's not at all what I said.
So, my point is, because of the key argument here is, there is an objective and absolute moral standard. That doesn't mean that because it has to be, you have to find how does that apply to the situation, which is the virtue of prudence. That doesn't mean that there's no objective standard and absolute standard.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying exactly that. There is an objective basis, although we don't always, we're not able to, we can't calculate. We don't know everything. We don't know, does this chemical worse for the river that I dump into? There are things we just don't know, but the principle of trying at least to minimize harm, that doesn't change. Although we might fail, I might act with good intentions and fail, then I learn from that, right? So that's what morality is. It's not following rules.
I'm challenging just the principle in your question, because if you mean to say, well, it's so hard to know, it's right or wrong to use contraceptive, then we don't really know if there's a moral standard. I, as a Catholic, say no, it's not right, because the far, I don't know how to say this in English, but the far consequences that are hard to predict for us lead us into a greater harm than the benefit of using contraceptive now. Consequences that sometimes God can see, we can't see.
So how do you know that? How was that told to you? How was that communicated to you? Where did you get that absolute action, or inaction in case of avoiding? Where did you get that from? How did it come to you?
Well, revelation, the church teaches that. I mean, remember, we follow not just a bare book that we interpret on our own, but a church, a tradition, a community. That was held commonly by all Christian churches, by the way, until 1930. It wasn't just a Catholic thing. Then all other denominations, most of them changed at that point. I think we argue as Catholics from the point of view that if you separate the two things that should always be together, sex was created by God for bonding, and for babies. The main things that result from that. And you shouldn't separate them. That's our main
And to
key.
sell products too.
It helps for that indirectly. Shouldn't be used.
All right. We're just out of time here, so I'm going to move on to audience questions.
All right.
But thank you for the discussion.
Feedback.
Yeah, it's a feedback. Justin, you're doing questions? All right, we're going to do, here's how, I'm sorry.
All right, that's that. We're now going to take questions from the audience, and we have 45 minutes for this. But the time goes by very quickly, so please be concise with your questions. When I give the word in a moment, please form 2 lines, one in each aisle, and we will alternate between the 2. If you have a question for Mr. Barker, please line up on my left. And if you have a question for Father Laborde, come to my right. If your question is for both speakers, just choose a line. And we do allow questions for both speakers. What will happen is if you ask, let's say, Father Lucas a question, we will allow Father Lucas to respond first, followed by Mr. Barker. Please have your question ready when you get in line. When it's your turn to ask a question, please begin by designating which speaker you're addressing your question to, and keep your question short and to the point. Please refrain from statements of any personal opinion, reading from a long quote or anything like that, trying to get your question out as quickly as possible. Please don't argue with the speakers. and also